speaking about this subject and to educate us. I also want to point out this is in part of a series of the CMHC History Exploration Committee, of which we've had several extraordinary experiences already. Lucille Bruce, Keith Calloway, Melissa Dennis, Erica Richard, Karima Robertson, and Richard Ewens. And so thank you to all of them to keep these things flowing and to educate us all about who we are and where we are. And so that's all I'm going to say. I'll turn it over at this point over to our Director of Social Work, Maria Oliva, for a few words from her.
I was muted. I said a whole lot while I was muted. Thank you, Dr. Cerniak. And I am very excited about this particular series because our scholars in this event happen to be people with lived experience in the community who know and can speak about the urban renewal as we have read about it and known about it through history. We are very proud to have nurtured the history project through our restorative CMHC, which is an advisory council that we have here at the agency that all the LMHAs have, but we have really been in love with the history project. It is important to be able to look to our history, to our past, to be able to understand where we are today. And the urban renewal happened across the country. And when the revitalization, so-called revitalization started, New Haven and Hartford were among the first in the country to undertake the dismantling, as we have understood it, of neighborhoods, of communities, of connections. And we saw some disastrous consequences that came as a result of that. So we're going to be hearing today from people that can tell us through their own eyes. And in many instances, we're going to be looking through the experience of the eyes of a child, the eyes of children. The people that will be talking to us today were not grown when this happened, they were children. And that's a very, very important perspective because what they lost, they didn't have any understanding about or an ability to have an opinion about. It was just lost. Urban renewal, as Dean Lattimore called it, Negro removal, dismantled families, dismantled neighborhoods and communities, never to be seen again in the way that they knew them. Somebody else made the judgment that those communities could be disposed of. And it wasn't right then, and it isn't right now. And hopefully we have learned from that history. So I won't say much more about, because I think the proof is going to be in the pudding, and we're probably in for a very profound and moving event here. And I thank for the participants, Mr. Lewis and Ms. Spruill, for participating in this and taking us to school. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria, Dr. Maria Oliva, for that introduction. Really appreciate you and your support of this project, and also Dr. Mike Cerniak, who's been supporting us from the beginning. So thanks to both of you for joining us and supporting this project today. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started, just to let everyone know that we're recording this, so that you should just be aware of that. Please stay on mute until we get to the question and answer section if you have a question. In the meantime, so until you have a question, please stay on mute just so that everyone else can hear what's happening. The chat is active, but we're asking you not to use the chat until we get to the question and answer section. If there's a technical difficulty that you have, please let us know through the chat. But otherwise, we're not really looking at the chat. We're just going to listen to the testimony of the people we have here today. And we have a lot of moving parts here. So we have some audio, some video, we have different things going on. We're screen sharing, we're switching who's sharing. So please be a little patient with us. If we have a glitch, hopefully we won't, because we practiced many times, but just be aware that we are juggling a couple different things here. So again, if there is some technical issue, please let us know. With that, I'll get started here. Okay, so the song that I played at the top of this is In the Still of the Night. It was by the Five Satins of New Haven. So this is a New Haven doo-wop group from the 50s. And they recorded that song in the basement of a church in New Haven. And they became, you know, like famous in a way. And they were presented in New Haven across the country. So that was the little clip that I played. As I was preparing for this presentation and working on this particular slide, it was sad that I received, at the same time, I received an email from the New Haven Register, and the headline was that Fred Paris, the co-founder of the Five Satins, had passed away that day, and that was last Friday. So that was kind of a moment of, I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I was sad to receive the news that he had passed on Friday. So I just wanted to acknowledge his passing, and that he and all of the Satins made a major contribution to New Haven and represented New Haven well over those years. So I want to do an introduction of our guest speakers. Mr. Ronald Utsi Lewis, that's his nickname that he's known by in New Haven. He was an English teacher in New Haven for many years. He's a semi-professional tennis player. He served in our military and was deployed to Vietnam. And for us, he's the proud father of Britt Lewis, who is one of our esteemed social workers here at CMHC. So we want to welcome Mr. Lewis to this event and thank him for his participation. And we'll hear much more from him later on in the presentation. Serena Spruill is our recovery support specialist at CMHC. She is a proud great-grandmother, and her hobbies are gardening, crocheting, and knitting. She is a certified vegetarian chef from the National Gourmet Institute of New York. So we're also honored to have Serena with us today, and we'll hear much more about her story as we go through the presentation today. So just to give everyone an overview, we're covering a lot of ground here, and this is kind of just a big overview of what we're going to do today. So we're going to start off by talking about before. So before our participants were forced to move across the city. So that's our first section, is called Before Urban Renewal. We'll talk about the very beginnings of CMHC. So we have some interesting trivia on CMHC that happened in the 60s. I'll do a little bit of discussion of Old Dixwell, how the old neighborhood looked at that time. And then we'll talk with our participants about what happened after they were forced to move. What was their life like after? And so we'll have a section on that. And we'll end with a discussion on how the past is still with us, is still present in our lives today. We'll end with that, and then we'll have some time for question and answers at the end of this. But that's sort of where we're going for today. Okay, life in New Haven before urban renewal. So this is an old photograph of a park on Legion Avenue. So I just thought this was interesting because you can see Legion Avenue today is much wider. Those houses are no longer there. The park is not there. So all of that was torn down, but I thought this was an interesting little snapshot of what the neighborhood used to look like on Oak Street. So the 1950s of Oak Street was the most densely populated neighborhood in New Haven. It was racially integrated with African-American residents and many Eastern European immigrants. So we'll hear from Italian-Americans. We also had Portuguese Americans there, a lot of European immigrants. We had some Jewish residents who lived there and African-American residents of Oak Street. So we'll talk more about those things, but it was a densely populated neighborhood. You had lots of small businesses in the neighborhood, lots of mom and pop shops, open air markets, restaurants, tenements, and cultural organizations. So it was a very poor and struggling neighborhood, but very full of life, very vibrant, and almost self-sustainable. You sort of could buy everything you needed within the neighborhood. So that was part of Oak Street. The Oak Street neighborhood demolition began in the late 1950s. 900 households were demolished and 250 businesses were forced out. Many of them never recovered, never found another place to go. So there was a lot of destruction and loss in Oak Street. 56% of the households were white American households. Many of them moved to the nearby suburbs or to other neighborhoods in New Haven. 40% of those households on Oak Street or near Oak Street were African American, and they were reassigned. So it's interesting that they didn't really have the option of moving on their own. They were reassigned to relocation areas. Most of those areas were in the already overcrowded Hill neighborhood, and also some of the new public housing projects that were built in the Dixwell area, the Dixwell neighborhood. And I'll say that Oak Street was the first neighborhood in the city to be demolished, and you had the demolition in phases. So Oak Street was first on the chopping block, and people were dispersed to the Hill, to New Hallville, to Dixwell. And then as those neighborhoods started to go through transition and demolition, they had to move a second and sometimes a third time as the demolition was moving across the city. So Oak Street was first. And you can see here, the goal was to connect 91 and 95 and to create this Oak Street connector. And so that's essentially what happened. And the secondary purpose of this was also to eradicate an existing slum. So we'll talk a little bit about that word slum and how people think about what actually happened in the city. So this is a before and after map of the area. You can see on the left, very densely populated, lots of residential places, small businesses, a really densely filled neighborhood. And on the right, you can see the Oak Street connector coming through and what is now the Air Rights Garage, right? Although that came later, that's now what this area looks like. And so you can see it's a radical difference, and I don't think any of the structures survived being in that red line, that demolition zone. Okay, we'll turn to our first guest, Mr. Lewis. Do you want to talk about your life on Oak Street? Mr. Lewis lived on Oak Street, so we're lucky to have him with us, and let's hear about his life as a child on Oak Street.
Well, I'd probably like to start on Dixwell Avenue. That's where I was born, on 58 Dixwell Avenue, where my mother's holding me there. I'm probably about 3 or 4 months old. I don't know why she had me in a house rather than a hospital, but that's the way it turned out to be. And on the right, I'm looking at my brother Budgebee. Let me go back and explain our names. Ronald Utsi Lewis, Richard Budgebee Lewis, and Edward Teo Lewis. My mom raised us more or less by herself. And when she wanted our attention, she called us Richard, Edward, and Ronald. When she wanted us just for any other reason, she called us Budgebee, Teo, and Utsi. The sad part about that is Budgebee, my brother, died when he was 17, probably of cancer. We had moved to Oak Street at that point. And things being what they are, his life probably would have been saved if we had had some sort of a medical place to go to hospital or something and knew we had programs that would take care of the kids in the city. Later on, I did move to Oak Street. I moved to Oak Street from Dixwell Avenue. They talked about urban renewal, and on Oak Street, we lived in a store. They showed some pictures of stores and storefronts. When I say we lived in a store, we actually lived in a department store. It was a big open building with no walls. It simply went from the front to the back. And my mother was sort of strange in her ways. She wouldn't let us walk through the bedrooms. We had to actually walk in the hallway, and there was no hallway. It was simply one big open building. I say a store because our front, when you came in the front door, we had these 2 big picture windows where they would normally have displays. But here again, it was the store. One Italian gentleman had spoken about the slums, and the slum here, because we had a front door to come into the store, but the back door was an alleyway. And you didn't want to be back there with the rats and anything else that could be back that could do you harm. So they talk about the urban renewal, and at some point, we were glad to get out of or get off of Oak Street. We didn't know what was coming, and we moved to a much better place. But living there for 2 or 3 years of my life wasn't the best experience in the world. I didn't really realize how poor I was because we did have different kinds of neighbors. But when we did move to Rockview, it was a totally different story. We had green grass, we had a front and back door, we had hardwood floors. It was then a community. Down at Oak Street, I had friends, but you didn't really knock on someone's door to say, hey, I'm in trouble or something like this. I don't remember that happening. I remember it happening more in Rockview, where neighbors looked out for each other. And if you did something wrong, someone else's parent could say something to you and it would get back to your mom or whoever you were living with at the time. So that's my story from Dixwell Avenue, where I was born. Going back, there was a funeral home right across the street called Keys Funeral Home. And my grandmother had a running joke with the owner of Keys. She always told him he would die before she died. As it turned out, he did die before she died. So that was just a joke on Dixwell Avenue. I further remember Sweet Daddy Grace coming to Dixwell Avenue, famous Black religious gentleman. He was so important and powerful at the time, they would close off Dixwell Avenue and put a red carpet down. And he would march down Dixwell Avenue to his church. This was something that was pretty much unheard of for a Black man to close down a city street in New Haven. You're reminding me now of a time when the Yaleys used to come back to town. They would get a float and they would come down Dixwell Avenue and they would toss coins at the little Black boys so they could scramble. And that's what it was called, a scramble. And they would hurt each other going for these coins. And it still maddens me now to think about these privileged young white Yaleys had the nerve to come into our neighborhood and throw coins at the young Black kids there. I was too young at the time to participate, but my brother and my other brother, Edward T.O. Lewis, would participate. And they'd get knocked about and beaten about for little more than nothing.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. I've heard about that scramble from other people in New Haven about being thrown pennies from the Yale students, and the little kids would run after it, not realizing how, some of them didn't realize how demeaning it was.
They didn't have enough nerve.
Pennies.
They didn't have enough nerve to send dollars. They threw change.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And now we're listening to, this is an audio, this is an interview that took place in 2018. This is a gentleman named Michael Solano. So he lived on Oak Street too. So we'll play this. This was about 3 minutes. So just bear with us. He has an interesting story to tell.
I mean, I've heard you talk about your neighbors and how well you knew your neighbors and the kind of community there.
There was no driveways, there was alleyways between the houses.
Yeah.
But I always like to use this term. Today you have 911. In my day, we had the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's cool.
If John Martin was lost and Mrs. Martin wanted to find John, she didn't call 911. She called next door and said, "Did you see Johnny?" No. And your neighbor would call him, and that was the sense of neighborhood. And today, you're dependent on government.
Mm-hmm.
If you were broke, your neighbor might lend you a couple of bucks. Charlie Butch at this corner meat market and grocery store, he would have a little piece of paper there with your name on it. When you got a few bucks, you'd pay Charlie.
And then, so how did the neighborhood start to change, would you say? I mean, you mentioned the supermarkets coming in. Were there other kind of things that started to happen?
World War II came along.
Yeah.
People started to accumulate a few bucks.
Yep.
Like me.
Yep.
And I decided I would like to move out of the city where I could have a driveway for my car. That's another thing. Before World War II, there weren't that many vehicles around.
Right. But was it, I mean, there was no highway either, so all the trucks had to go through there, going to New York and everything?
Down Route 1, just Columbus Avenue.
Columbus Avenue.
Which, unbelievable to see the trucks that used to roll through there at night.
Yeah. It must have been crowded, dense, noisy.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
They would start rolling at night, and they would, during the day, not bad at all. But at night, it was Route 1.
So World War II happened. Was there kind of a exodus out of that neighborhood, or was it slow, or?
Slow.
Yeah.
I was the first.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
We've been talking about the Oak Street connector that went through and that whole project. I guess you had moved out just a little before that.
But what happened there, John?
Yeah.
You knocked all the little businesses out.
Yeah.
Now, Oak Street predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And delicatessens, chicken market, hardware stores, all that got destroyed. Was it good?
He ends by saying maybe. Was it good? Maybe. So Mr. Lewis, I want to ask you, as a former resident of Oak Street, do you have any thoughts based on what he's saying? We'll just have sort of brief comments from yourself and from Serena.
Well, he spoke about the neighborhood. I don't remember much of a neighborhood. Of course, I had friends there, but I don't remember going to other kids' houses to play. We played outside. My mother worked at Winchester, where they made bullets and guns and things of that. And she'd bring bullets home. And what we would do is, my brother, a little bit older than me, he would take the bullets, put in a big garbage can in the back of the yard, and we would duck the bullets firing through the trash cans. And when they weren't doing that, they were selling rat tails. The church had put out sort of a bounty on rat tails. I think it was 25 cents. That's how many rats were in the community down on Oak Street. You talked about the small businesses. I know it's a long time ago, and I can't remember any Black small businesses there. There were businesses there, but I don't remember any Black store down in that Oak Street area. Maybe it's just my memory slipping at the point, but I'm not sure.
And the rat tails, just to explain to the audience, that was a form of extermination, right?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was, because
afford to get an exterminator, and they asked the children to go and kill the rats, essentially.
Exterminator, that wasn't something we knew about. That was just something where the church had said, to try to get rid of some of the rats that were there, you just had to put out a bounty on them. And the bigger kids in the neighborhood would get the tails, turn them in, get the money, then probably go to the movies.
Wow, that's amazing. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. Serena, are you here with us? Is Serena here? Are you? I don't see you on the screen. Do you want to comment on this at all? On what the interview was talking about, Mr. Solano?
No, I don't have a comment on this. That whole thing about the rat tails is driving me crazy.
Yes, it's at first I didn't understand when I first met Mr. Lewis. I couldn't understand exactly what he meant, but adults in the neighborhood would pay the children to kill some of the rats. Yeah, I think that's a boys thing. I don't think the girls probably did any of that. Okay, we'll move along. Sorry, okay. So Serena, this is about your before redevelopment story. And do you want me to sort of let you speak and then we'll go back to the photos later?
Yeah. I came from a family of 12, and I am number 11. My parents came up from Greenville, North Carolina. My mother passed away in 1956. I was around 2 years old, and my baby brother was 6 months old. My father had some kind of agreement with the city of New Haven, where they would purchase the properties of land that they wanted to use for some future development. Those inhabitants would move out, and my family would move in. And we would then stay in the property until the city of New Haven was ready to begin working on that particular renewal project. It was a way for the properties to remain occupied and not contribute to blight. The city didn't have to then worry about squatters or taking over the property either. Our family would stay in a house, usually for 1 to 2 years at a time. I did get attached to the house on 432 Chapel Street. That was the only place where we lived that was above a business. The first floor was a restaurant. We lived on the second and third floors. We'll see those later on. The backyard had a pear tree and a grapevine in it, and I love that house. We would make as much noise as we wanted to outside and on the third floor, and on the second floor was the be quiet floor. We did that, we did it too. It was never a problem. And I could look through the chain link fence and see the park on East Street, and that was around the corner. and I cried when we moved from there.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna go back and show the photos. You can sort of
Yeah,
explain a
show
little
the
bit.
photos. Mhm.
Okay, this is the first one.
Okay, the picture to the left is the corner of Grand Avenue and Franklin Street, and right where the triangular sign is, with the person walking across the street, that was my family's house was like right at that corner of Grand and Franklin. And so that was where my mother had passed away in that house in 1956. And then also, that was the first house that I remember that we lived in. And then further back on 4 Lion Place, on the other picture, on the right-hand side, is back on the other side of that same highway. So we lived on both sides. We lived on both sides of that project. So that was crazy. You know, they just moved us further down, you know, on the project. We lived in one house, then we moved to another house, you know, where they did, you know, like I said, they worked on both sides of the project. So that was, you know, I thought that was, you know, that was significant, right? So they affected our family twice for that same project. You can move
Yes.
forward.
Okay.
Okay, so this is Audubon Place and State Street. Well, yeah, me and Karima was in awe when we saw this property, right, Karima? This property has all people in it, lawyers, groups, and jury duties, places, parking spaces in the back, and all kinds of things in this building. So, so my family lived in this. You know, our house was removed for this professional building to go up in the parking lot in the back, and I thought that was strange, and I think it has something to do with Yale, also. I just thought that was strange that, you know, we would our family would be moved for a building such as this. Yeah. 432 Chapel Street. This building is, I think, the Department of Transportation building now. And this is the building that I cried when I had to leave, because this is the building that had the pear tree in the backyard and the grapevine. And this is the building where I could look through the chain link fence and see the park on the other, which was around the corner. And I absolutely loved this house. And I really, really was devastated when we had to leave it. But they changed it into Department of Transportation. Yeah.
And you can see the highway going right through the back of that building. Yeah.
Right. This is 111 Winter Street. This is behind the Stetson Library in the parking lot and back of the Stetson Library on Dixwell Avenue. And where I'm standing at is where my house was. So they tore my house down to be a part of the parking lot and back of the Stetson Library on Dixwell Avenue. And yeah, that's me, and that's where my house was, parking lot.
Yeah. So this is not related to the highway at all. It's just part of the neighborhood. That was torn down.
Yeah. Right. Part of the change that they wanted to make in the neighborhood.
Okay, thank you so much, Serena, for sharing that, and we'll come back to that in the discussion. But a lot of interesting changes that you had to go through as a very young child. So we'll come back to your story also.
Okay.
So this is a little bit about CMHC. This is kind of before there was a CMHC. This is what the block looked like. So you see Howard Avenue with lots of residential properties along Howard Avenue, very densely populated. Park Street and Oak Street. So altogether, you had 104 households Now, some of these were single rooms where you had people renting a room in a house. Some of these were houses where you have 1 or 2 families in the house. But it was densely populated. So if you think of families, 104 families with multiple children, it was a very densely populated block, and at least 5 small businesses. There were probably more, but the names here are from the phone book from 1960. And so according to the phone book, there's 5 registered small businesses that were on this block before it was torn down. So here I've kind of highlighted some of the interesting things here. The small businesses were Howard Cleaning and Pressing, Howard Shoe Repair, and Harry and Bernie's Grill. That's kind of the top triangle at the top of Howard Avenue in that corner. You see some of those businesses. Down on Oak Street, there was the American Window and Cleaning Company. Also on Oak Street was a doctor's office. They had 3 doctors in that office. And I've highlighted some of the larger rooming houses and the Oakmeyer apartments where you had many people living in that apartment building. So just a sense of some of the sort of the highlights of the block, but again, very densely populated, probably many more businesses because you had a lot of storefronts like Mr. Lewis was talking about. But this is what I could gather from the map and also from the phone book from the 60s. Okay, so land acquisition for CMHC was an interesting story here. There were 29 properties on the land that we occupy. 14 were successfully negotiated with the owner, so those were not a problem. And the state paid them to leave. 15 were to be condemned. And they had appraisals and they were registered to be condemned. One owner protested that, and there was a sort of a haggling back and forth about the amount of money that the owner would accept for leaving that property. So that the article kind of outlines some of the issues, some of the prices that were haggled over. I think at some point someone offered him a higher price than what the state was actually willing to pay. And so they had to have a new procedure for approving these amounts of money because the owner was promised something that the state later on was not willing to pay. So that's an interesting little moment about how people were forced to leave. And this one owner, I think it's this person here in the picture in the bottom, you can see the construction of CMHC and one house down in the left-hand corner. I suspect that might be the person who was holding out for the better price for his property. Okay, CMHC 1964, we had a major crane accident during construction. We had 2 construction workers who were hurt. One of them almost died, could have died. A crane fell along Oak Street. So you can imagine a huge crane falling the length of Oak Street, going into the Park Street intersection with Oak Street. And you had a construction worker in the cab of the crane that was being crushed in there. So all the first responders had to come in and hike up the crane, which was tons in terms of weight, and then trying to pull him out of there. And another person was on a 2nd floor scaffolding. So a scaffolding working on the 2nd floor, and he fell from the scaffolding when the crane toppled over. Luckily, he wasn't hurt badly, and the first gentleman was not hurt badly, but it was for the one that was trapped underneath, in the cab and underneath the crane, it was very perilous situation for him. He's very lucky that he lived. And he wrote a letter to the editor thanking all the first responders who came to save him because he really could have died in that accident. Also, you had the crane, there was oil in the crane or gasoline that leaked, and he also was at risk of burning in that. So luckily, none of those things happened, but it was a very scary situation for him. And in the background, you can see Grace Hospital, which is now Yale New Haven Hospital. So he was pulled out from under the crane and rushed over to that hospital. Okay, 1965, CMHC's topping out ceremony. I had never heard of this. I don't know if other people have heard of it, but and the article is kind of, it's hard to see exactly, but they're putting up an evergreen tree on top of the building. So the topping out ceremony is an old, very old Northern European custom that is apparently still practiced today, where you, as you're constructing a building, you have the highest beam, the sort of the top of the roof, and you have someone sign it. I guess whoever the owner is would probably sign that beam. A tree would be placed on top of it. In this case, in many cases, you had a tree and a flag on that top beam and put in place. there, and there was a ceremony. People came out to watch this ceremony. It's supposed to be a sign of good luck. It's sort of wishing good luck for the continued construction and the safety of the workers. And it's thought of as a blessing for the construction workers and the people who will inhabit the building. So this was done in 1965. And I thought it was a little interesting that, and we can talk about it in the discussion. I'd never heard of this, but this is something that was done then, and apparently people still do it now. So this is a before and after. This is the block, densely populated block in 1961. And this is the same block in 1966. It's been completely cleared, and we just have our building here in 1966. And this was our opening day, 1966. This is the Department of Psychiatry, faculty and staff for the Department of Psychiatry. Many of them also work for CMHC. CMHC and the department kind of, there was hardly any daylight between the two. So this was the opening day photo for CMHC. Okay, so this first part was about sort of before demolition, and then this is how CMHC was kind of born out of this demolition. And now we're going into after. So we'll speak to our speakers about their life after they had to move. Okay, so Mr. Lewis, do you want to talk to us about your life at Rockview?
Yes, it's funny. I see the picture on the left, your left, my left, I don't know, is my mother and my grandmother. And we lived in Rockview Circle. We had to walk from the bottom of the hill up the hill for about 6 months because a bus could not turn around in the circle, or so they thought. So imagine my mother, my grandmother, her 3 boys, walking up the hill with groceries for about 6 months. The weather changes over the course of 6 months. The picture in the middle is my little sister, Sherry. She's the only one my mother didn't really give a crazy nickname to. That was Rockview about 1960. And then on the right, that's my judge friend, Billy Webb, and myself in Saigon. He helped to get me through some tough times, both in college and during the war. And to this day, he still remains a very dear friend of mine. And in that picture, shortly after, we ducked for cover because it was actually a war going on.
Any more that you want to say about Rockview?
Well, Rockview, yeah, thank you for even reminding me. The one thing I noticed about Rockview, we had every different kind of ethnic imaginable. We had Jewish people, we had Asian people, we had African-American, Portuguese, Puerto Rican, Irish. I used to babysit for my Irish neighbors and my Italian neighbors. And there I felt the community because people were a lot closer. And I didn't really realize I was poor until many, many years later when I really got into college and realized if you made so much money or didn't inhabit so much money, you were below the poverty level. So out there was a different kind of a world. There was a lot of freedom. We had clean running water. We had pets. Reminds me of one story. I had a dog named Rover. And because we let our dogs run free, because of the open spaces there, the dog would come back to the house when he wanted. We'd go outside when he wanted to. The maintenance man loved our dog away from us. What he did was he'd feed my dog and love my dog. And I'd see my dog somewhere down in the park, and I'd call to him. I'd say, "Come here, Rover." And Rover would wag his tail, and he'd come to me in a loving way. He'd roll on the ground. I'd pet his belly, and then he would go back to this new owner. And we never tried to get Rover back because we figured the man loved him, and that's all that really mattered. So I had a good experience in Rockview. From there, I went on to the service.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So for you, it was a positive experience moving to Rockview at that time.
Away from the rats and living in a store, I'd say it was a very positive experience. I understand what you're saying about the urban renewal. A lot of people were pushed out. And I don't know where a lot of them went, but a lot of people did come to Rockview and Brookside. And for a lot of people, it was moving on up. Have the things that we had there that we really weren't accustomed to down on Oak Street.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to play this short clip. This is an Italian-American police officer who talked about his experience with urban renewal.
Was the part of the Hill area where you grew up affected by redevelopment at all?
Oh, yes, definitely. It destroyed the entire neighborhood.
Really?
I lived on Carlisle Street, which is off of Howard Avenue, right near the railroad station. And that was completely destroyed. So in fact, I always remember with a little bit of bitterness because the neighborhood was structurally, the buildings were sound and it was a nice neighborhood and it certainly was a safe area. And they knocked my house down and they didn't do anything in that neighborhood for 10 years. They just left it a mess, similar to Legion Avenue and Route 34 connector. And you sometimes wonder, why did they do that? Everything was fine there. It wasn't a problem for redevelopment purposes. They did that, and it took so long for them to do anything to make it a better place. But most of the neighborhoods, especially the Italian neighborhoods, coincidentally were strongly affected by it.
So did you have to move then? I mean, were you living in the house right before it was torn down?
Yes, we had no choice. It was either that or face the wrecking ball while we were in the house.
How old were you?
I was 12 when we moved. And my mother had lived there, I don't know, 40, 50 years before that in the same house. So it was a difficult transition. And I fought it tooth and nail. I refused that. We moved to North Haven, which is a beautiful community. At the time, it was more woodsy than it is now. But I used to actually take the bus almost every day after school just to go hang around the corner with my friends, or even hitchhike. Then that was a popular thing. Now you wouldn't dare hitchhike. But just to go down there and hang around. I mean, a lot of that time was wasted, unfortunately. I didn't know it because I thought I was enjoying myself at the time. And I did that right up until after I got a vehicle, and even after I was of age, we found locations to go there, bars and restaurants with our friends, and we stood there for quite a while. So there was a very, very strong magnetism. And it wasn't only Italian Americans. The group of men that I hung around with when we were growing up were of all backgrounds, Irish, African American, Jewish, Portuguese. And we all did the same thing. We all came back to the neighborhoods. I don't know if it was the ethnic portion of it or it was just the group of people that we all felt very comfortable with. And we stayed that way for a long time until now it's totally changed. Everything has changed now.
Mr. Lewis, do you want to respond to that? Do you have any thoughts based on what was said?
No, we sort of see things differently. I don't know. He speaks about, like it was everyone hung out with everyone else. I don't really remember that part of Oak Street. I don't remember having any Caucasian friends as I did when I moved to Rockview. Like I said, the businesses, there were no black businesses. We had our characters. We had one gentleman down on Oak Street. He used to be a fire blower. And we'd go out on a Friday night and watch him up on the second floor, get some gasoline or kerosene and blow fire out of his mouth. And one time, I guess the wind blew the wrong way and he burned himself and we never saw that again. But this was part of the entertainment that we had on Oak Street when we weren't dealing with the rats and the vermin and everything else and the bullets being fired through the garbage cans.
Did you ever feel like you wanted to go back? Did you ever have that pull to go back to Oak Street later on?
Never. Once I left there, I had no desire to go back there. I will go back one time, though, when I came back. I was in the service from 64 to 67. When I came back on leave one time, I remember that the city looked depressed to me. It just looked like it had no life to it. And I told a couple of friends when I got back to New Mexico, and I said, I went to my hometown and it looks like it's dying. But then after, when I got out of the service, 67, came back out into college, I saw the vitality, and it just made my heart warm to think that my city was making a great comeback. Another thing, living in the community, I remember someone mentioned Dick Lee. He was the mayor at one point. Dick Lee was so cool that he lived on Shelton Avenue in New Hallville.
Wow.
And I thought even at the time that was impressive because there were a lot of African-American families around him, and here was the mayor, easily accessible, right up on Shelton Avenue. Like I said, we see things a little differently. And urban renewal, I guess things had to change. And I don't like the idea of hearing about so many people being dispossessed, but change has got to come about. And I'm glad to this day that you have a CHCP and you do the things that you do for the community.
Thank
So
you.
some good came out of something bad.
Yeah. Thank you. Serena, do you have any thoughts about what the officer said about his experience?
Yeah, I had an experience for on Carlisle Street too.
Was the
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had an experience on Carlisle Street too. I lived at 127 Carlisle Street, and I had just made a new white friend, and then one day she came to me crying, and then when I asked her why, she said that her father said that they had to move away, and we had just become friends, so we both were devastated. So, and I think that was like the beginning of white flight, at that time in my life, and in the neighborhood, and everything just snowballed after that. So so it started to affect the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you moved to the Ashburn projects.
Yeah. From there we moved to 57 Ashman Street, and that was our last redevelopment house. Directly facing me, across the street from that were what we call the low-rise projects. On the same side of me across the street were the high-rise projects. The low-rise projects were 2 stories high. The high-rise projects were 8 or 10 stories high. I had friends in both of them. I would play in the stairwells, the elevators, and the main floors. The elevators didn't stop on all the floors. You had to stop at the floor nearest you and walk the rest of the way to your apartment. I had a little cement stoop at my front door where I would play at my house if I didn't play in my own backyard. The high-rise projects did have a huge playground in the middle of all of the 4 to 6 buildings for the children that lived there, but it was small in comparison for the numbers of children utilizing it. There were lots of large minority families there. You would have to wait for the swings. The low-rise also had courtyards in the middle of their buildings too. Even though we had those spaces to play, there was no grass, only cement. There were 90 to 95% full of Black people in the high-rise and the low-rise projects. There were very few Hispanics, very few white people. The high-rise buildings were clean in the beginning, and then the drugs came into the neighborhood, and it began to smell. Around 1964, the early 60s. So I think I was about 9 or 10 years old. Yeah.
That's interesting. And what you're saying about the drugs coming in, you could tell even as a child that things were changing for you.
Things were changing. Yeah.
So this is what it looks like today, that same area today.
Right. That was at 57 Ashman Street. So yeah, and I was right at the corner. I had at that property, like where that sign is, there was a store right at the corner, and my house was there next to the store, and then on the other side of me was Catholic school. St. Martin de Porres School was right next to me. Yeah, and those projects now, they tore the low-rise projects and they made the Monterey projects. That's what they call the Monterey, but they used to be the low-rise projects. Now they're the Monterey projects. Yeah, at Webster and Ashman Street. Yeah. Oh, Dixwell and Munson. Yeah. So that was where, after redevelopment stopped, we still moved, but after that, and Dixwell and Munson was the next place that we moved. My father and I and my younger brother, We stayed in that building on the 3rd floor, right-hand side in the top, for a short period of time. My father didn't pay the rent like he was supposed to, so we had to leave that place. She locked her stuff up, and we had to leave that place. But we got an apartment way down the street, a few blocks down, Dixwell and Division Street. That house was torn down, and now it's a community garden in that space. So yeah. So that is where we moved to after redevelopment ended. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So this is our last interview that we're going to play for today. I don't know if people know Lillian Brown, but she was well known and beloved in Newhallville. And she died in 2018. She was 100 years old. And she was very involved in the community and also in the politics of City Hall. So we'll play a few minutes. I think it's just 2 minutes of her speaking here.
But what about the later, the stuff that happened in the early 60s when you were here by then, right?
I was in this house.
Yeah. Were you aware about this? Were you involved in the community at that point?
Yes.
What kind of involvement did you have then?
They called a lot of meetings and whatnot. I tell you one thing that I always suspicious of, and I can't verify it. But Dick Lee, he came out with the idea of the small city. And he got thousands, millions and millions of dollars from Washington to do the city over. And he started, I don't know where he started in the Hill or where it was started up here. But in my opinion, he did it to get white people out of this neighborhood. Because he paid a fortune for some of the houses that was left up here. And there was a number of little dumps. But he paid fortunes to get them people out of here. So the whites moved out. When I moved on this street, I was the only black family living on here. In fact, it was about 3 families living in the whole Newhallville, about 3 black families. And when he started this renewal thing, natural, they all would flock to get the money to move out. So they all moved out. And I truly believe that was his purpose.
Why would he want to do that?
I don't know. Don't ask me why he would have. But I really, truly believe that's why he did it. But then after they all moved out, because across the street was big multiple housing, all of that was torn down. All where you see these apartments where Wendell have now was mostly multiple housing. He tore them all down and left big deep holes all over the neighborhood.
What kind of effect did it have in the neighborhood? Having these park, I mean, I imagine it wasn't a very good.
It wasn't. It was just big holes dug all over the city, especially in Newhallville in the Hill neighborhood.
Okay, so for Mr. Lewis, any thoughts on what she's saying there?
I do want to go back to Dixwell Avenue. On Dixwell and Webster, where the Elks Club is, it used to be a mosque, a Muslim mosque. When I was about 16 or 17, I had the wonderful pleasure of having Malcolm X come to the mosque to speak to us. He came inside, and at some point, someone asked him, they said, well, excuse me, Brother Malcolm, why aren't there any white people in the mosque? And Malcolm X said, listen, anyone who wants to can come to the mosque. We're open to everybody. All they have to do is say the password. Someone said, well, what's the password? He said, I'm black. And at the time, people were calling themselves Negro and colored, and we weren't using the word black as much as we do now. So to hear that, it was wonderful. It was like validation for us to be able to say, we're black. We come in all different colors, but we're black. That's what it all reminded me of, that with Dixwell Avenue.
Wow, thank you. I never knew Malcolm X was in New Haven. That's interesting.
Yes, he was.
Wow, cool, very cool. Serena, do you have any thoughts about what Ms. Lillian Brown was saying about Newhallville?
I remember when she said about the holes in the ground. I just that triggered something. I do kind of remember the holes in the ground, you know. But yeah, you know, that was what I remember.
Okay. It's a little unsettling, right? What used to be.
Yeah, I
there is not there.
remember the holes in the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to quickly go through a couple of slides on the Dixwell neighborhood, and then we have one short video clip I want to play, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So I'm going to quickly go through these. This is a little bit about Dixwell neighborhood. It was the 5th area to be demolished. 70% of the population was African American. 1,100 households were relocated. So this was a huge project in Dixwell. And as you can see from some of the photos that it wasn't related to the highway necessarily, right? But still, there was a lot of households that were destroyed. 30% of the units were demolished. 200 businesses were closed or relocated. And many families from Oak Street had moved to the Dixwell neighborhood. And the photo here is the original Q House on Dixwell Avenue. So Dixwell was kind of what people called at that time the New Haven's Harlem was Dixwell neighborhood. We had a lot of cultural institutions. You had jazz clubs. Sorry about the ambulance. You had a dance studio that all the kids wanted to go to. So that was a really popular thing. Every year they had the recital. You had the Freddie Fixer Parade, which was about cleaning up the neighborhood and having people help pitch in to clean up. And then to celebrate the end was a parade started by a dentist in the neighborhood started this parade in '62, and it continues on to today. And the photograph at the bottom you see at the center was Jackie Robinson, who was the guest of honor that year. That was in '72. And his wife, Rachel Robinson, is next to him. And she actually was the head of nursing at CMHC at the time. So they were both very involved in New Haven at that time. And Freddie Fixer is a long-standing tradition in New Haven, and people from all over the country come to attend the Freddie Fixer Parade. You had a whole economy around Dixwell Avenue. So you had lots and lots of small businesses that were owned by Black and white business owners. And you sort of could buy anything that you needed in that area. Lots and lots of small businesses. And the money was kind of circulating within the neighborhood. Here you have a few more small businesses. And I love the little ice cream guy on the bicycle from way back in the day. That's Hood Ice Cream guy. And this is a quote, I think it's from one of the newspapers about Elm Haven, which was one of the big projects, and the Dixwell Avenue area had a lot of shopping and cultural things happening in the neighborhood. You also had large department stores downtown. And this particular writer is talking about many restaurants downtown would not serve African Americans. But in the article, he's reassuring the reader that it's not a thing to worry about because you had many restaurants on Dixwell Avenue. So for those African Americans who were refused service downtown, they could always go to Dixwell and have a good meal there. So again, kind of using part of the racism of the time to actually celebrate some of the restaurants on Dixwell Avenue. So that's a little clip from one of the newspapers. Winchester Repeating Arms was a huge factory in New Haven. Many African Americans in that time worked there. Mr. Lewis, do you have any words about Winchester?
I guess when I think about Winchester, the fact that my mother worked there, when I came back from the service, I was offered a job at Winchester. And the day that I was supposed to start, I got my acceptance paper at the University of New Haven. Best day of my life that I didn't have to go work in a factory.
Fantastic.
It worked out just fine for me.
Right. Good, perfect timing, right?
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of people in this area worked in Winchester Repeating Arms and did sort of manual labor and work around manufacturing. So that was very common. And Winchester was one of the biggest employers at the time. So this is kind of wrapping up. After this 1967 riots, which were all across the country, you had riots, race riots in 1967. I think in part of it is a response to all the sort of upheaval of urban renewal and the dislocation of all these people. So you had a report that was commissioned to understand what was the source, the reason for all the riots. And here, this quote talks about that a lot of the money that was available to people, many of the persons in need never receive that federal money. So that there was lots of federal money around, but people who were supposed to receive it didn't. And that's one reason why the poverty was so severe. And there's a lot more in the report there, but that's just one little quote. And this just talks about New Haven, and they do talk about New Haven in the report, which is interesting. There were a number of low-income units assisted by federal programs. And then you had many of the housing units were demolished. 6,500 units were demolished, which is huge for a city of the size of New Haven. So this is it kind of documents what was happening in terms of housing and education, lots of different things in New Haven, but we just pulled these little pieces of data for this presentation. We'll certainly come back to this report in our next presentation. Okay, so my last question, and then we're going to do the clip. So the past is the present. The picture on the top is the current brand new Q House on Dixwell Avenue, and the bottom is Broadway, this sort of old Broadway, and you can see Yale right behind Broadway. So I'm asking my guests, and you can answer maybe after the video, as you move through the city today, what are your thoughts about urban renewal? So let's hold that question, and then I'm going to pass it to Lucille, who has the video clip queued up. It's about 2 minutes, and then we'll hear from our presenters, our speakers, about their thoughts about urban renewal, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience.
Haven is rebuilding each one of its 47 school buildings, $1.15 billion, and today is selling time on stage.
You're taking my house, you're not giving them enough money, and you haven't given enough thought to the tenants.
My house, paid for, is not much, but it's mine. But who am I? I can't fight City Hall.
Yale New Haven Hospital wants a sanitized corridor built around the whole medical school complex. This is a step in that direction. No doubt in my mind.
Instead of investing resources in bringing this neighborhood up to a place where people could continue to live, they just decided they were going to choose this area to demolish.
I already know of families that lived here that are now homeless.
I think you're presenting sour grapes. Their children in this neighborhood deserve
the community where the children are going to come from.
We were arguing about a neighborhood that had deteriorated into absolutely nothing.
The mayor, I spoke to him personally. I told him it's not fair. He says, well, then sue the state. Sue me.
People do have to step forward and say what's happening to you is wrong. And then people start to say, yeah, it is wrong. I felt like it was wrong, but I didn't feel like I had any right to say it was wrong.
Well, thank you, Lucille, for sharing that. That was a clip of a documentary called The Hill, about sort of the current situation in the Hill with eminent domain for many houses there. So I'll toss it back to Serena and then Mr. Lewis about thoughts about the trailer for The Hill.
The trailer?
Oh, I'm sorry, the thoughts about how you feel about urban renewal today.
I just think that things they could have been better. It could have been more comprehensive and rewarding for everyone if people were listened to and utilized. Because of the way they did it, you know, people have been alienated and they suffered needlessly. Many lives, families, and businesses were lost. Hundreds of small businesses were lost for parking lots, and especially like on Ashman Street. The children, they couldn't play out. They can't play outside There's not enough green spaces. The kids can't do that because it's just too violent now, and the parks are far away and there aren't enough access. Community gardens were taken away. That big one, remember, Inner City Co-op Farm on Orchard Street was taken away, where all the families with benefits and the benefits from that big garden were taken away. And you know, that was terrible. That's all.
Yeah, so for you, it's a lot of loss that happened, not just the different places where you lived, but also the businesses, the sense of community. It was a lot of disruption for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Lewis?
On the one hand, you know, I drive around the city quite often, and I think about and I see all the wonderful buildings going up, and New Haven seems to be very progressive at this point. But I wonder where the poor people go to. I just think about it as they're building these buildings and these high rents that most people can't afford. What then happens to them? It's still a great place to live. I love New Haven. It'll always be my town. But the thing is, I have these fears, like I said, for the people that can't afford to live in these wonderful new buildings that they're putting up everywhere. So where do the people move to?
Exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, for being with us today. We're going to open it up for discussion and for some questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, and we'll try to get to you for your question. I see Roy raising his real hand. Roy, you're on mute. Roy? Yeah, you're on mute. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, hey, Ron. Ron and I Louis and I are best of friends, by the way.
Great.
Yeah, I grew up in New Haven also, but I also admit I worked for the Rehabilitation Agency and was actually served on its board for some time. Back when I started, I was fresh out of college. It seems at that time such a noble thing to do. You know, we were going to change New Haven, fix New Haven, and some things were fixed, but unfortunately, a lot of people were hurt by it. And Serena here, her experiences. Some other things that came out of the agency that people don't talk about is that it really increased the Black middle class in New Haven, because a lot of managers and administrators there were Black. You had guys like John Daniels, who became mayor, Ernie Osborne. There were a number of people. So in that respect, it was a positive thing, because back then, Black folks couldn't get those kinds of jobs in the private sector. And there were a lot of folks who worked in the agency. Just one point of correction. You had mentioned the Freddie Fixer Parade, Dr. Smith.
Yes.
He wasn't a dentist. He
wasn't a dentist?
No, he was not a dentist.
I'm sorry. There was this article.
He was an MD.
Okay.
But the Dr. Smith was part of it. But a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Davis, who was Black and who was the administrator for the Dixville Project Office where I worked, had a lot to do with starting the Freddie Fixer Parade.
Thank you.
Some other things I just happened to notice. You had a picture of Schifrin's. My father worked there, and my aunt and uncle owned a restaurant on Dixville Avenue, and my grandfather worked in the old Harlem barbershop. You probably remember the Harlem barbershop, I know. So I have some very, you know, I live in Miami now, but I still consider New Haven my home, and come back frequently. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the insight that you bring to this.
Yeah.
Rook, I just want to share. Going Karima with Roy, when I lived on Dixville Avenue, we lived right next door to Dr. Smith. Right. And I know that he was a dentist because we could hear the people screaming every day when he was working on them. So when you and I get together, we'll have to do something, because now I think he was a dentist.
No, I'll bet you any amount of money that Scott was the
You're on. You're on after this.
Okay, we're going to have to investigate this.
Yeah, Scott, Scott was the dentist.
Scott was a dentist also. I understand.
All right, I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, check it out. I'm
Okay.
righto.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Bob?
I had to unmute myself there.
Yeah.
So thanks for a fantastic presentation. It really means a lot, and I know a lot of work went into this. A couple of comments, both perhaps trivia, but Karima, when you're talking about the topping off
yes.
ceremony, so I'm in my office at my computer, and so I just did a quick search in my files and found that there's a press release that we issued. I won't read it, but in 2008, when there was a topping off ceremony for the most recent building addition for CMHC. It's the part of CMHC that on the first floor houses the Hispanic clinic. Second floor, it has research labs and a big conference room, W212, and on the third floor, it's all labs. And yes, we still do topping off ceremonies, and it was newsworthy. We had representatives of the governor's office. I can't remember if it was lieutenant governor. We had state legislators. We had a speaking program. It was a big deal. So thanks for the memories about that. The other thing, just on a more personal note, and Lucille has already heard me talk about this. So my brother and I largely grew up in West Hartford, having moved up to Connecticut from northeastern New Jersey, where the good Dr. Steiner also hails from. And my father was very insistent that in Connecticut, the best bagels and bialys came from this neighborhood in New Haven, that we would not find them in West Hartford or Hartford, that on a weekend, I can't remember if we drove down here on Saturdays or Sundays, but it was a regular thing. And it was before, I think it was before I-91 and 84. And so my guess is that we came down probably Route 15 and then made our way to Legion Avenue or Oak Street, wherever there was, in my father's view, the best bakery for bagels and bialys. And we would get them and they were still warm. And we would drive all the way down here to do that, and then drive back to West Hartford, just because this was like the mecca for Jewish bakeries. So just a personal memory of mine from my West Hartford days.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. We have in one of the interviews, it goes on to talk about coming down for bagels and in this area, in the Oak Street area. So we couldn't play all of it, but there was he does, one of the interviewees talks about that, about the bagels and other the little shops that were on Oak Street in the Oak Street area. Lucille, I see a lot of hands, but go ahead, Lucille.
Oh, I just want to thank Serena and Ronald and Karima, but I wanted to ask if it's okay to ask Dr. Oliva a question, having listened to this now for the hour. And that is, Maria, when you think about clinical care, because we serve a lot of adult clients at CMHC, many of whom would have gone through the kinds of experiences that Serena and Ronald talked about, or they would have been little kids coming up in those projects. And, and I was just wondering from your perspective, like, how do you think history can become part of clinical care? Social history, like the kind of history that we've been describing here, versus personal history, because we do a lot with personal history, but social, political history is what I'm wondering about.
Okay, I didn't think the question was going to be that involved when I said, sure, go ahead, ask me. But I do have an answer for that and some thoughts about that. And in a sense of community, you have connection. And in connection, you have a sense of safety. And what we've heard about today is how all of that was dismantled, displaced, uprooted. People were really not treated as though what they had mattered. And we can hear that it mattered tremendously. And so in the minds of children, what they knew and what was safe for them was taken without explanation. They watched their parents be vulnerable and helpless to have a voice and to have any input into what was happening to them over and over in some cases. So if we look at folks that are now adults and perhaps in the mental health system, our own system, we know that we can ask not just about what happened to them in their families, but what happened as a result of what was imposed by the environment. And that is not a conversation I'm sure we've had, especially if we didn't know this history. It is devastating and does have long-lasting effects, but we now have a conversation that we didn't have before. We can't go back, but we can certainly validate their experience. And when we hear about adverse childhood experiences, the loss of safety is one of the biggest, and that's what they experienced. So yeah, it has a big bearing on clinical care.
Thank you, Maria. We have William Webb has his hand raised.
And that's the gentleman that was in the picture.
Really?
With Mr. Lewis, yes.
Oh, oh my gosh. Where is he?
Let's see, Roy and I
there
grew
he
up
goes.
together. In fact, I was talking to Let's brother Tio this morning about Roy. And I look forward to coming down to Florida and reconnecting. Two things struck me about redevelopment in New Haven. The first was when I lived in the Elm Haven projects. And when they built Winchester School, they tore down a large number of homes that Black people lived in. The second thing was a large number of Black middle-class homes were torn down to make way for parts of Yale New Haven Hospital and the Oak Street Connector, which ran out to the highway. Those were some of the more pernicious aspects. In fact, it was funny, a couple of years ago, I went back to take a tour of the Elm Haven projects, only to find out they've been torn down. So a lot of things have happened in New Haven.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. Jennifer has her hand up. Yes.
Hi. So I wanted to thank the speakers. That was really fascinating. I'm from the Hill of New Haven. I was born like the next street over from here. So it was really cool to hear about such a background about my hometown. And also I was interested in if the series is going to go forward in the decades, if we could learn more about what happened in the 70s and 80s, that would be cool too, just to kind of see where the trajectory lies, because I know my family, my dad's from Puerto Rico, he didn't come till the 70s, and my mother was born in the 60s. So it was really interesting, and she was born in Yale, she was from the Hill as well, so it's interesting to see when she was coming up, a lot of this stuff must have still been happening into the early 70s and going on. And I remember growing up later, just sort of seeing that the shifts were still happening, and there was still a lot of white flight happening. And, the Hill was still kind of going through a lot of shifts, and it, went through being a good neighborhood or being a bad neighborhood, and just sort of seeing that and having more like historical background is really cool. And it was just great to hear y'all talk about it. And I would love to see if this series continues and just sort of exploration of how this town sort of evolved and who were the casualties and how we can make a difference. Sorry if that was long. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. We will continue. I'm not sure how far we're going to get. I don't know if we're going to make it to the 80s, but we will continue, and we'll have another program later in the spring, this spring.
Awesome.
Are there other questions? I'm trying to look at the
Can I just say one more thing, Karima?
Yes, please.
We just had Martin Luther King's Day. And in 1963, I was one of the people down there in DC. I just like always to remember that because my life has been impacted by some absolutely wonderful, wonderful people. Not only blacks, whites included, but I've met some historically monumental black people. And it's made my life something special for me, having been in the same room with some of these people.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow. So you met Malcolm and Martin.
Yes, yes.
Wow, amazing.
And down at Schubert, I met the gentleman who wrote, what was it now? The Fire Next Door. What's his name? Help me remember. James Baldwin.
James Baldwin.
He was down at the Schubert Theater, and he was there for the presentation of A Raisin in the Sun. And I saw him, and I had to go introduce myself to him, and it was an honor to see this very slightly built man who was a giant.
Yeah.
So I've had the opportunity to meet some wonderful people in my lifetime,
New
including Billy Webb and Roy Snyder.
Yes. New Haven was an important stop for people, leaders, Black leaders and entertainers, traveling between New England and New York. A lot of people stopped through. So we had even Harry Belafonte was at on the flyer for the Satins. You had Harry Belafonte. Mr. Belafonte was one of the performers alongside them. So New Haven was a very important place, especially at that time, for entertainers and Black leaders to come through here. So thank you for pointing that out to us. Other questions or memories? We have about 2 minutes.
Well, since we have 2 minutes, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I remember when I remember when Muhammad Ali came to town.
Yeah.
He was Cassius Clay at the time. I was on Broadway. I was with a white friend of mine, and he saw him in the car. So we got in the car and followed and went down Shelton Avenue. I went up and I shook Cassius Clay's hand, and then my white friend approached, and it was the coolest thing. He said, "You're okay," to my white friend and shook his hand. Because people had the impression that Muslims wouldn't shake a white person's hand.
Wow.
So New Haven has had so many wonderful people come here and so many wonderful things. So good luck to all of you and good luck to New Haven in the future.
Wow.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. And Serena, thank you so much. We have a wonderful panel today. And also thanks to Mike Cerniak and Bob Cole, who helps with this, and Maria Oliva, who is leading us with Restorative CMHC, and all of our committee. We have Erica, Richard, Lucille Bruce, Richard Ewins, Melissa Dennis. We're a small but mighty committee on the history committee. So I want to acknowledge all the people who serve on that committee. And that's it. Lucille, do you want to talk about the next panel?
Sure. I just wanted to give everyone a quick preview of coming attractions. We have a few things planned for this late winter. And this phase of the History Project is going to conclude probably in early April, date to be announced. But this is going to be a presentation called Trouble Again in Psychiatry, the CMHC Controversy of 1969-70. So make sure you watch your emails for the Trouble Again in Psychiatry. That's going to be a good one. So
yeah,
thank you very much again to Mr. Lewis, Ms. Spruill, and
Yes.
Dr. Karima Robinson, who did really such a huge amount of work putting this together. I just really want to thank her especially and for everything that she did to make it happen. So thank you all for coming too.
Thank you all for coming, everyone. Thank you for our presenters. Great work, everyone.
Oh, look at that.
Okay, am I the host or you're the host, Lucille? I think, Lucille, you're the host. Yeah, you're the host.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just paused the recording. And so Serena, thank you again. That
Thank
was
you so
terrific.
much. You're welcome. That was amazing.
I thought it was completely spot on and amazing.
Yes.
No glitches.
No glitches, yes.
Wow, that was, did you enjoy yourself, Serena?
Huh? Yeah.
Did you enjoy
I was
it,
happy
doing
with
it?
it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I was happy. I
Thank
was
you.
happy with
Thank you
it.
so much. Oh my gosh.
Really, really well. There's a
Yeah.
lot.
I see Gene Steiner stepped in. Is Hiram still on and Mr. Blumenthal?
Is that
maybe they
the
walked away.
Mr. Blumenthal? It is the Mr.
Thank you, Jane.
Blumenthal?
This is great. Thank you.
No, it's Lisa. Sorry to disappoint you.
Okay, I was gonna say, oh my goodness.
Miss Blumenthal. I can't believe I started with Mr. I don't know why.
You too. I love you too.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's been both a blessing and a curse to have that last name here in Connecticut. So. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. I just don't know how to click it off now. That's why I'm still on. So.
Oh, you're still on?
Thank you.
Oh.
Karima, great job. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for attending, everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Later. Bye-bye.
This is great. So I'm going to jump off, but maybe we should have a debriefing meeting with everybody.
Okay.
We should definitely do that. And Serena, I didn't get a chance to tell you that there is an honorarium coming your way of $200. So we got that confirmed today. So I just really wanted to thank you again and tell you, I'll be in touch with you about that. But we were able to do that. So
this was so great. I'm so happy. Thank you, Serena. You shared so much of your personal story, and it was really
that was great, Serena.
Beautiful.
I was really struck, Serena, by how often you moved and all the different locations where you lived, and there's very few actually of your houses that remain. Which is very touching.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, when you put it all together, it's really quite impressive, the amount of demolition, you know.
Yeah.
So,
but Lucille, that house on Carlisle Street is where she lived with Fred Harris, was on a different floor, right?
Yes.
Right, Serena?
In that house?
In that house on Carlisle Street, right?
Yes.
So
okay,
that's
well,
where
that
she would,
picture is a
babysit.
keeper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We're going to need that picture then for our next presentation. So
Yeah.
we hang on to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I lived on the second
interesting.
floor on one side, and he lived on the first floor on the other in the same building.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
And what year?
I don't
Well,
know.
we'll follow.
What year?
up.
I was in the 5th and the 6th grade. So I just have to do the math, but I'll do the math and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you said
we got time.
I was about 11, 12,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
I can figure out the math and we'll get it straightened out.
Yeah.
Okay,
Cool.
people.
All right.
Thank
great
you
job.
both. I'll see you
I
later.
love you guys.
Love you too.
All right.
Thanks again.
All
Thanks,
right. Thank
Karima.
you.
Congrats.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.